Hi, I'm Patricia Grabarek.
And I'm Katina Sawyer, and welcome to the Worker Being Podcast. So today we are so thrilled. We have an amazing guest. We have Dr. Nikki Blacksmith on the show, and she is a co-founder and co-CEO of Blackhawke Behavior Science, which is the world's leading expert in understanding and leveraging team human capital for accelerating startup growth, diversity, and success. So Nikki, we're so happy to have you here today. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. And just love to hear you introduce yourself a little bit further. Like, tell us more about your background and, how you decided to start Blackhawke.
Sure. So I'm an industrial organizational psychologist.
Woohoo!
Yay!
Yay! And the quick and dirty answer is that I saw a problem in the real world and couldn't help myself. What happened was I was reading an article that was talking about venture capital funding for startups. At this time, I was, consulting for a venture capital firm in New York City, so I was really reading a lot and trying to kind of get up to speed on, just the basics, because I hadn't had a lot of experience in venture capital at that point. Anyways, I saw an article that said about less than 3% of women receive venture capital funding. And my head about blew up because I, as an IO, have always specialized in recruitment and hiring. And in the hiring world, that would be completely illegal. So to me, I was just like, how is this happening? Why is it happening? There's got to be a solution. We can fix this. So I really started doing, it took me years of research just trying to understand startups and the decision-making process that investors go through. And eventually I realized we can use all the IO psychology science to address some of the issues that are happening and hopefully reduce that gap and diversify the entrepreneur field.
I mean, we obviously love that because as women who founded a company, and I know you are as well, that's something that we're also super passionate about and obviously want to promote more of in the world. And so because you're an expert in this area, you've spent years studying this and now you've spent a lot of time practicing this as well. It's clear that you think like people and the power of people and your background in IO, just like us, really are central to the success of startups. And you mentioned, solving some of these big problems like bias and, lack of diversity. So why are people so important in startups and how does focusing on people help change some of those problems you just brought up?
Yeah, I think people are the center of startups. They're basically one and the same when it begins. So if you have a startup at the very, very beginning, like idea stage, you really only have a person or two people or three people. There are no buildings there's nothing else but the people. So obviously getting the right people together to start with is critical for startups. Most startups fail because of people-based conflict, team-based conflict. A lot of co-founders have conflict and split up. I've seen some really nasty breakups, I would call them almost, between founders that, end up suing each other and, big fights and the business fails because of it. And I think that's sad because those are easy, fixable problems. So people are critical. If you look at the startup rate of success, it's about 75 to 90% failure rate, depending on where you get the data, which is very high. So in my head, I'm thinking, why is this that high? Like, there's got to be a way we can reduce it. As a society, we've studied business, and for a long time, we know how to help large organizations be more successful. So why can't we do the same for the startups? If you look at the research, most of it says that it comes back to the founder as the failure of the company. But you'll see things like marketing strategy, and there wasn't any product market fit, or the timing was wrong. And to me, those are probably reasons why the startup failed. But if you go back to the basics, like there's somebody behind the marketing strategy and behind the product development. So it ultimately comes back to, are these individuals in the company the right ones? And are they, building a team that's going to grow together in a healthy way, get along over time, and tackle a lot of challenges.
Well, when you were talking about the breakups, I was like, Katina and I can never break
I
up.
know. I was like, you're scaring me. Stop it.
If we're getting on the verge of a breakup, Nikki, we're going to be calling you and being like, don't let us break up. Help us. Help us.
Couples counseling, please.
There was one startup. I mean, the reason they broke up was because they had 3 founders, and each founder kind of had their own idea of what the startup was going to be. So having that like shared mental model and that overlap of where you're going, where you're starting, I would say start there. And it sounds like you two are already there, so you're ahead of the curve.
Yay.
Yes, that's true. I mean, we definitely did like a visioning activity back in September, and we both went in separate rooms and like wrote down all this stuff, and we came back and it was like almost identical. It was kind of it was wild.
Yeah.
So thank you for making us feel better.
Yes.
It's a simple thing, but you'd be surprised how often that conversation does not happen.
I can imagine. But on the note of what you're talking about with like the people and getting the right people in place, I guess there's a couple of questions that stem from what you were saying there. So like the first one is like, how do startups attract those right people, and how do they create cultures where the people actually want to be there and they're happy and they're thriving and they're doing what they need to be doing to make the organization successful? Like, what do you typically see?
What do I see like in
work well?
What I would recommend?
Yeah. Okay. How about what do you recommend? Let's go there.
I'm not sure if I've seen anything work really well.
Okay, so what would you tell them to do since no one's doing this well?
I mean, we're still in the infancy of integrating, people science into startups. Mostly, if you just Google it on Amazon, you'll get things like marketing and finance and product development, but rarely will you ever see, teamwork and team building and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say, what I always recommend to startups, and when I've seen it start off well, I've seen a lot of start off well, and it's hard to define success with a startup because you got to wait like 5 or 10 years to see if it pans out. But start by defining the core values. And this goes to the culture piece as well. So a lot of times people think when they're starting a company that they don't need to think about the culture or the values of their company until they start hiring a bunch of people, because they kind of bucket into the HR branch. But if you ask me, I think it's probably one of the single most important things a founder can do, because it creates boundaries and parameters for them to work within. And it helps, if you have, say, like, these are our values, and a customer comes to you with a project, it's very lucrative. If they don't fit in your values, I mean, for the company, that would be, not a great decision to go forward with that. But if they have those values in place and they can see how it doesn't align with what they're trying to do very easily, then, it's a lot easier to make those decisions. And beginning from the start to build a culture is critical. My co-founder and I, we sat down and asked ourselves, eventually we're going to be an employer, right? And as I was a psychologist, like, what kind of employer do we want to be? What kind of company do we want to be? What do we want to stand for? And we spend a lot of time thinking about that. But now every decision we make comes back to, is this who we are? Does this fit in with what we're trying to do? And it also, like, once you start bringing on employees, it creates a level of empowerment you wouldn't normally see with the decision making, because they know where the boundaries are. And a lot of times in startups, people don't know where the boundaries are. So that's where I would start, I think, is start by defining the core values of the company. Like, what do you stand for? What are you going to do? Why are you doing it? And then make sure every decision is aligned with that moving forward. That creates a way to create a culture like intentionally, instead of what I see a lot of times happen is startups get together, they don't think about, the people-based concepts because it's soft, it doesn't bring in money right away, and they end up, I think we all saw Uber, as an example in the news a while back, and they had a terrible culture of sexual harassment and unethical behavior. And likely that stemmed because there was never a point where they defined what the culture was. So it just kind of unraveled. I never worked at Uber, so I don't know, but seeing it from the outside, that would be my guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you're bringing all that up because I think we have talked a little bit about culture, but we should probably talk about it more. One thing I do think is really interesting, like you were saying about being aligned and having those kinds of conversations where things can just sort of happen, but you're not really cognizant of it. So like we had a conversation about what we want to be doing, like task wise, like where we want to focus our efforts and energies and whatever. And we realized that a lot of the time we were spending was actually not aligned with what we wanted to do. And so it was just an interesting thing of recognizing like, oh, if this is what we want to do, then we should do more of that and less of these other things. Right. And it's such an easy thing, but if you don't like make it explicit, you can fall into a pattern where you're kind of not paying attention. And then you end up kind of getting swept away by whatever like people are asking you to do, or whatever the people that come in the door bring with them as a culture or their attitudes or how they add to things. And then all of a sudden it's like you lose control over what you had because you're being pulled instead of you pushing it. It sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's a way better way to describe it than I described it. Absolutely. And I think one of the things too that I didn't mention, but once you have those values and those things in place, probably the second most important thing that's, I would say, not talked about enough is self-awareness for the leader. So the leaders, the founders, they have to model those actual behaviors that they're trying to encourage and reinforce. And so having a really realistic like look at oneself and reflection upon, am I behaving in a way that I want my employees to behave? Am I representing these values that I hope to reinforce in my company? But self-awareness is of course a lifelong journey, but I think it's way more important for a startup leader, because that is almost the definition of the company. Everyone's going to look to them to see, how should I behave? How should I act? So they need to be hyper aware of how others are perceiving them.
That's a really great point, because I just think about like even Katina and myself, right? Like we tend to work longer hours than maybe we'd recommend others. And if we get to a place where we are an employer, we don't want to create a culture where people are working really long hours and, leading towards burnout. We want to make sure that our culture is one that obviously espouses our values, the values of everything that we are educating people on and wanting to focus on. And so but you can't tell people like, oh, no, you need to only work, the basic number of hours and then send emails in the middle of the night, right? Or work really late yourself and stay, like, let's just say if you're in a physical space, stay in the physical space long past everyone else, right? Be there before everyone else arrives every single day. So then you're starting to show that actually, maybe we should all be working that hard. And even if you truly do not want your team to be doing that, they will probably start to follow suit, and you'll create a dynamic where people think that they need to be there all the time or whatever, right? But in this example, like when it comes to things like burnout, and co-founders and founders tend to get very obsessed with their work because it's their passion, right? That's why they're doing it. But they need to know, like, if they want to create an environment where people have balance, you have to also show what it's like to have balance. And that's just a very salient example for myself, but it leads to a question that I had around what people do in startups to support employee well-being. So like, what are some good practices, innovative practices that you've seen where even though startups are kind of high pressure in some ways, what have what are good founders doing to support the employee wellness, or what are you recommending people do?
Yeah, so what I've seen, and hopefully we see more of a shift in this way. And by the way, I do the exact same thing, your example. So I need to watch that myself as well. But anyways, the things that I've seen that have worked well and that I recommend start with kind of like a basic philosophical or humanitarian type of viewpoint, is that we're all people and we're not evolved to work in a building for all day long. Like that's just not our background as human beings. So we have to really take into consideration like what does it mean to be a healthy human being, and what kind of environment do we need to build to encourage the wellness that. And when I say wellness, define it as truly understanding what creates a positive environment and healthy environment for people. I can give you a good example. I used to call it dungeon or the jail cell, but it was this office, and you would go in it, and all you saw was like a long hallway of offices. All the doors would be closed, and there weren't really any windows because it was made out of repurposed old building from something else that wasn't designed to be an office building. And I think I physically felt my like levels of vitamin D go down, and I could feel it in my body, like the fact that I just didn't have light for 40 hours every week. Um, it took a toll. And so thinking about the person from a holistic standpoint, not just work, like what is it, the physical, mental, emotional aspects of wellness, and bringing and integrating those into the workplace, I think is a really cool way that I've seen companies start to address how to improve wellness. Another really innovative thing that I've seen, and I don't know if I would really call it innovative as much as it's just not done right now, like in workplaces, is that we focus on the process and learning rather than the outcome. So a lot of times what happens in organizations is that somebody might make a mistake, and then the leader gets upset, and that person from then on there out is working in fear that they're going to mess up and they're going to get yelled at. Some companies are doing things like where they get together and focus on past failures and mistakes that have been made, and they talk about them as a learning experience rather than as a performance issue. So if you think about work, the way we work right now, we focus so much on the outcome, and we want that outcome to be perfect. And if it's not, there's problems. But what's not realistic for human nature, like human beings are going to make mistakes no matter what. It's inevitable. So shifting the focus to how did we handle the mistake and what can we learn from the mistake, and really spinning failure into a positive experience can help well-being a lot, because it creates a really a better culture, with stronger psychological safety. Moving to the idea that no one's perfect. The fact that we even try to pretend that we can be is ridiculous. And we can, as people, start to view work a little bit differently, and think about failures and mistakes just as growth and learning experiences. And this goes in someone's personal life as well. Like bad experiences, they're like built into our body. They were made to happen because like for example, simple evolutionary psychology would say that if you think about the fear response, fight or flight, that is our body. There's trouble in the situation, and we feel a physical response to it. We feel a lot of physical responses to a lot of things that happen in work, and negative experiences can really take a toll on somebody if it's not handled right. But if we can change those negative experiences to be actually like, this is inevitable, this is what we expect to happen, how can we actually handle it? So instead of focusing on the mistake, you focus on how it's handled. And I think that can remove some of the fear that exists in organizational cultures, and create a much safer, psychologically safe culture.
Yeah, I think you gave so many good tips there in terms of how to really think about your culture, more consciously, but also some of the things that you mentioned are really like base core principles of what makes for a good
Yep.
workplace, right? Like making sure that you're thinking about wellness holistically and not forgetting about some aspects. So it's like, yeah, maybe we have like a really, fun team, but we're all stuck indoors and we don't move and we're like vampires, like perhaps we should get outside and do something like that would be good. So there's like all different aspects to it, as well as creating that team culture, psychological safety, like you were talking about. And so I'm sure when you go into companies and folks are looking for some guidance around these kinds of concepts, some of the ways that you get them to embrace some of these more innovative ways of doing things is to help them overcome some misconceptions or, misperceptions that they might have about what makes a successful startup. And you mentioned a couple things before that people usually focus on, like, oh, it was marketing or it was product strategy or whatever. But are there some things around the psychology of startups or the people aspect of startups that you feel people just get wrong and you hear over and over again as like common myths about what you need to be successful? Like I remember when I was in consulting and Patricia was in the assessment space for a long time, but I remember like I would hear from clients a lot, like, yeah, like especially like, managers that have been around for a really long time. Like, yeah, like everyone else probably needs those assessments to understand who's the best fit for the job. But I just know, like I've been doing this for so long, I can pick out who the best person for the job is immediately, And so you kind of have to sit down with the person and like, okay, actually, this is what the data suggests. And you might actually have the most bias, the longest history of feeling pretty sure that you know exactly who a person is as soon as you start talking to them. Like that might be an even bigger problem. So I'm sure there are things like that out there in startups that people think like, oh, to have a successful startup, it has to be like this. Maybe it's based on the media, what people have seen, et cetera. But what are some of the things that you think people think that they have to have or think being in a startup is like, that they get wrong compared to what you just mentioned actually creates something that's really sustainable?
Oh my goodness, there's so many of them. Well, you mentioned kind of that gut instinct. I hear that a lot from venture capitalists. Like, oh, we just know talent when we see it. We just know when a good team is a good team, versus, really assessing and using human capital data to assess those people, instead of snap judgments made after maybe like an hour conversation. One thing that I find, and kind of goes to the earlier question you asked just before this, is that a lot of time founders, they have an idea, right, and it's theirs, and they're protective of it, and they bring in people to work on it, and there's this mentality of you work for me and do what I say. That feels like the workplace in 1980s, not the workplace of 2020s. And so I'll give you a good example. I was working with a CEO, and he was all about wellness. He was creating this company surrounded, like he wanted every aspect of his company to be, to foster wellness in his customer base. Emotional, mental, spiritual, like you name it. Wellness was like the center of it. And then I was talking to him, and he was frustrated because one of his employees, brand new employee, probably 2 or 3 weeks into the job, wasn't working around the clock, wasn't working 90 hours. And I just like,
Oh, no.
I didn't even know how to respond because I just laughed. I'm like, okay, if you really truly want to create a company around wellness, let's start with your people first. And working 90 hours is not healthy. And you should never expect that from somebody. You don't even do that. So having this idea that, change it from like you're working for me to you're working with me, I think can maybe address some of those issues. But work is not separate from wellness, which is what I had to explain to them. Like people spend most of their times at work, so the experiences they have there are greatly impactful in terms of how they view their overall life. So one misconception is that kind of like wellness and people are separate from the organizational experiences, and they're really not. They're kind of one and the same. Another interesting misconception is that people tend to think that entrepreneurs are very high risk takers, And actually, they tend to not be. What happens is people on the outside see them as risk takers because they think, oh, that's a really risky, you know, idea. I would never do that myself. How, I'm so surprised that somebody's doing that. Um, but what's happening behind the scenes is they're taking calculated risks. So for myself, if you just, saw me and my co-founder and we started this company, you might think, oh, that's super risky, but we know what we're talking about. We have a PhD. We've been thinking about this stuff for years. We've been working on this stuff for years. Like, it's not a huge risk. We're not just like creating a new app and jumping into a space where we have no expertise. If I was starting a beauty company, maybe that would be very risky for me because I don't know anything about it. But most entrepreneurs are very calculated, and when they take risks, they define the issues and potential fallouts, and really think through, is this the right risk to take? Because there are a lot of risks that come up. If you think just about, for example, accepting funding, you might think, wow, that's great. Like, you're getting, $1 million from this investor. Why is that even a decision? Why do you think about that? But in the reality is that founder is going to be working with that investor for 5 to 10 years. So it's really like, is this a relationship I want to build? And so having that understanding before the risk, they define and confine the risk parts of it and make that calculated risk. So that's probably one of the misconceptions. Another misconception is that entrepreneurs need to be optimistic, which I 100% agree with, but this is where we get a little bit dorky in IO psychology stuff, but it's a nonlinear relationship. You need some optimism, right? You can't just go into and be like, oh, I'm going to fail right away. But a lot of times founders are over optimistic. They're just so optimistic that they don't see the potential pitfalls or, where the risks lie. And so, yes, you do need to be positive and believe in yourself and be optimistic, but there's a line where it becomes too much, and it can actually be quite dangerous, because then you don't know when to stop on a certain project, or, realize that your idea is not that great and your customers have been telling you that, and you're just not listening because you think it's so great that you're just not talking to the right people or something like that. So optimism is one of those really interesting, tricky things about entrepreneurship. Is like, you need to be optimistic, but don't be too optimistic.
And that feels kind of tied to the risk-taking piece, right? Like, if you are too optimistic, then you might not take a calculated risk. You might take a random risk because you feel super positive. So it makes sense that those two things would kind of go hand in hand, that you'd be more calculated in your risk taking as well as tempered in your optimism. But those are funny because as you were saying them, so I feel like this entire episode, Katina, are going to keep bringing it back to ourselves. So
this is why we've invited you. Spoiler alert.
Like, please tell us all the things as entrepreneurs that we should be thinking about. But I was gonna say, like, Katina and I are both not risk takers, like, at all. Like, totally not risk takers. And then I would say we're fairly optimistic, but it's very tempered. Our optimism is very tempered. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about that.
The PhD territory.
Yeah,
that's true too.
It's always like, it's complicated. Like, what's the forecast? It's complicated. Like, we have a lot of confidence in our skills and abilities to do we know what we're talking about, and we know we can do what we need to do, but we also recognize where our weaknesses are, and we don't want to overlook those and just be like, they'll be great. So, like, I think that we try to be realistic, I guess, is part of the, like, tempering or something, which maybe is helpful.
Yeah, and also, I think, I don't know about you all, but as going through, doctoral program, you get trained to think critically and to question things. Which I think is probably what you all are really good at, and why you're able to kind of manage that risk.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do get kind of forced into thinking about things really critically, which is very helpful in an entrepreneurial setting. So that makes a lot of sense. But yeah,
I like to think.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say I like to think of my doctoral experience as training to be an entrepreneur.
I like that. That's interesting.
Boot camp.
But I was gonna say, like, I think those misconceptions are so, I mean, valid, right? In terms of the types of people that are in entrepreneurship and the types of startup cultures that are being created. But then I also think, like, the first one you mentioned around, like, you know, the expectations and things like that, right? And how people are going to be working within your own startup is really interesting, because I've definitely seen that as well. So, like, thinking about how to manage your people or your culture, like being, honestly, it would help your people if they know that you aren't just taking every single risk, right? They want to know those things. So it just feels like all of these misconceptions that people external to a startup have, once they're able to get into a startup, it seems like some of those things kind of go away and actually help the culture. Because if you trust that your founder is not going to be making risks willy-nilly, and they're not going to be you know, so optimistic that they don't see the challenges that you are currently dealing with, that would create a culture that's very difficult. So it's good to hear that even though we all from the outside might have these perceptions, actually a startup environment isn't as scary maybe to be a part of all the time, based on what you had just said.
Yeah, and you just reminded me of something too, another misconception. People in our society tend to have a mental model or schema or stereotype of what it means to be an entrepreneur. And usually they conjure up some image of a 25-year-old white male with a hoodie working in his garage. So I just want to take the opportunity to discuss that misconception real quick and say that you do not have to be a man to be an entrepreneur. There are a lot of women entrepreneurs out there. Their personalities vary so widely. There's no one size fits all. So I think we need to get rid of that misconception, and I hope IO psychologists can help with that, showing that, you know, gender really has nothing to do with how somebody performs.
And I think the age piece you called out is also interesting, because I do think you're right. A lot of people think it's some kid that, oh, like, you know, there's working out of their parents' garage, so they don't have to worry about money and they can just jump in. But a lot of people that start businesses are starting them because of issues and things that they've seen in the market through their experience. So they're not necessarily the like 25-year-old kid down the street, right? They're probably have some experience, some level of experience to be more successful. You need to understand your market.
At this. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, I looked at to kind of see what is the real distribution of age, and you know, it depends on the sample, of course, but most of the research, what I see is that usually late 30s, early 40s is the average age for an entrepreneur.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but it makes sense. It's exactly what you just said, right? Like, people don't want to just start a business without knowing what they're doing. They want to feel competent and like they've mastered things. So they're more likely to do it after they feel like confident in their own capabilities, which usually comes with experience and practice.
Yeah, it's interesting as you were saying that too, because I was thinking about, even for the misconception, which I think you're 100% correct, that people are like, oh, like every startup is like some like coding boy whiz genius that like starts some random thing. But even if you look at like people that do fit that actual stereotype, it's still kind of a myth. Like, yeah, like Mark Zuckerberg kind of fit that, right? But like, he was exceptionally good at coding. So it's not like random, right? Like, he wasn't just like, oh, you know what, I think I just want to start something. It was like he started something because he was good at coding. And then like Elon Musk, for whatever, but like if you look, like he had been in like a PhD program before for like physics, and he was like known to be an extremely exceptional coder. And like, so like, it's not like they started things that were like in some realm that they had no expertise in, that they were not recognized as skillful in. Like, it's actually quite opposite. Like, they've started in places where they had like a clear talent advantage to get going. And then it kind of sparks this misconception that like, oh, like, you know, I can just do that, but not realizing that like those are examples of people who actually have like an exceptional amount of talent in that arena.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting. And it just reminds me of kind of some stories I've heard about their leadership styles. But
I could imagine.
essentially, you know, you're right. They get into it in a founder because they are capable and technical in a certain area. Like for ourselves, for example, we're industrial organizational psychologists. So we're talking about teamwork and leadership and wellness and, you know, but eventually you get to a point where you're running a business and not, you know, working in your main area of expertise. And me personally, I cannot wait to hire a CEO because I love my IO psychology work and that's all I want to do. And I just want to nerd out all day. But most founders have a very hard time giving up that role because it's so glamorized and, you know, there's prestige in being the CEO, but also they don't want to hand over control or let somebody else take it. It's very hard to, you know, hand it over when you basically put all your, I hate cliches, but like blood, sweat, and tears into it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think that's probably why we see some of the wheels falling off from a people perspective in some of these companies where people are very highly technically skilled, but they don't try to do what you're saying, which is like consciously build a culture and show humility of what they don't know. So yeah, that all makes perfect sense. And is really interesting actually, because I think you're right. Like who people think are founders is off. And then even for people that do fit that stereotype, I think people forget that their level of risk that they took is much less than just some random person who was like an okay coder at their college or whatever, you know, and just thinks they could like mystically become this because somebody else did, right? So so yeah, that's super interesting. So I have a question that Patricia and I struggle with sometimes, which is you're obviously very busy and you're trying to get a company off the ground. And we know that people are really important and focusing on this is really important. And you mentioned that you did some conscious exercising around, you know, like, hey, how do we make sure we get the culture that we want and what's our plan and alignment and things like that. But could you walk us a little bit more through kind of as a company what you're doing that you also recommend your clients do? Because I know it can be difficult with being the person running the business and having all the business end of things to run to sometimes practice what you preach. So how are you kind of balancing that?
Now, that's a great question. I think sometimes I think of myself as like my own guinea pig. One big question that we had, obviously, and I think a lot of other leaders did, is how do we have a team virtually and create the same level of cohesion and you know, collegiality that you would get in person. And so one of the things that we did was to really put that like on the top of our mind, like every day, like these are people that are working with us and they need to feel like they're part of something. So we started in multiple different ways. First, there was a big onboarding process because we're IO psychologists and we that's what we do. So we had like a 2-person company and an extensive onboarding process. You'll probably never find that again. But it was really important for us to have the people that work with us know what we value, what we care about, and to kind of align themselves to that. And we showed them behavioral examples of what does that actually look like, you know, here in the culture. Also sharing the overall vision and keeping in high communication because things change really fast with the people you work for or with the people that are working for you, to remind them that like they might be doing something a little like working on a social media task, but it's actually a huge contribution because it feeds into these other, you know, bigger goals like creating an awareness of your company and you know, thinking about communications. So having them really understand that their work is meaningful and significant goes a long way. And I think another thing would be gratitude. You know, I was talking about stories about Elon Musk and others. And I remember this one story I read about him that, he had this employee that worked, he went to an employee and said, hey, can you do this one task that has never been done before? Most people think is impossible. Make it happen. And this guy worked probably for like 35 years on this project, finally figured out a solution that no one else in the world could have figured out, sent it to Elon, and all he responded was, thanks.
That's ridiculous.
Exactly. That was my reaction. Like, oh my God, like, what? This poor guy. He just like,
how anticlimactic.
He just made a miracle happen, and all you say is thanks. And I think that is, gratitude is overlooked, appreciating and saying thank you to your employees sometimes, and they end up leaving if that's the case. And you see high turnover in those kind of companies with leaders who don't appreciate the work and effort that people put in, because it does take a lot out of them. But gratitude is incredibly important.
That's making me laugh still. 3 to 5 years of working on something, and you're like, today's the day I finally solved it. It's just like, great. I got anything else?
Thanks, bye.
That's horrible. Oh man.
It was one part of what he was doing, probably. So to him, it was maybe a smaller thing, but to this guy, it was like, you just spent 5 years doing
Well, they probably
this.
paid him a lot too. I mean, I would imagine that, like, if you're gonna have someone spend that long doing just that, like, it should probably be important. I don't know. But yeah.
I think the other thing that maybe you don't hear as often that I practice what I preach is, I'm sure you've heard the saying that, like, running is 99% mental, only 1% physical.
Mm-hmm.
I think startups are kind of like that. A lot of it is about the mindset and your attitude towards the situation. It's, emotional contagion, for example. Like, if you are constantly negative, then that's going to rub off on other people. But if you're positive and enthusiastic, and you lift your employees up when things get hard, that goes an incredibly long way. So for me, it's like, yes, I need to do the work, but the work is just the work. I need to remember that this is going to be an incredibly difficult journey. There are going to be ups, there are going to be downs, there's going to be chaos. And I just need to not be, not complain, not be negative, and really just enjoy the trials and tribulations that you experience, because it's kind of like nothing you would ever experience, in other, you guys know, you've been doing it. Especially when you're working with a co-founder that you trust and that, aligns with your vision so highly, like, it's so much fun, so much fun. And just kind of reminding each other, like, my co-founder, she's amazing. I think for her and I, a lot of times it's like half of our job communicating with one another isn't about the task work. It's about motivational and pep talks and just helping each other, like, go along and realize, we're just starting, we shouldn't expect this. And just knowing that somebody is there. We always joke that, like, when one of us is down, the other one will bring it up, and so we can't ever both be negative or down at the same time. But it is really helpful because it goes back and forth. There are just issues, and having that social support and using communication as a motivational tool and not just as an information sharing tool, that I think I would recommend highly, because that, we talk about it all the time with ourselves. Like, what would we do if the other person wasn't here? I don't know. So for me, I think, a lot of it is around mental, like, mindsets and social support.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Everything you just said, like the gratitude piece, having somebody there for you, being able to, like, have open conversations about how you're feeling through all of this, but then also remembering to be grateful and thankful for all that you're doing and seeing and experiencing. It is its own journey, right? It's not like, unless you start many companies, it's not going to happen again, probably. And even if you start many companies, now you've got experience in starting it, so it's no longer that first time. So it's like a special magical time, right? And so I really like that advice, like making sure that you're taking that time to enjoy it, appreciate it, and then also be grateful for the people around you and all that they're doing and helping with. And that obviously will lead to, as we've talked about many times on the podcast, gratitude can lead to so many good things, both for personal wellness, team cohesion and wellness as well. So there's so many benefits to just having that type of mindset as you build your company. So I really love that. Go ahead.
I was just going to add one more thing, since we're talking about wellness and working way too many hours. I've started to I listen to my body. When it says go to sleep, Nikki, I go to sleep, because the work that's going to come out of my brain when I'm groggy and tired is not even close to the quality that I could produce, if my brain was rested. So I have a really difficult time with the 40-hour work week. And I like that we're moving away from it, because you can't force yourself to work if you're tired. Go take a nap. Your brain will produce and you'll do it faster too when you're ready and fresh. So a lot of people just push through. My advice is to listen to your body and stop when it tells you to stop.
Yes, that would be our advice too, for sure. Whether we listen to it every time is a different story, but yeah. I think that it is true, right? We know if you're not well, if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're exhausted, you're not going to be performing at your peak anyways. So why push yourself further? Especially as a founder, you have the flexibility to kind of set that timeline, right? So try to make it healthy as you're doing it. So I know we're kind of getting close on time. I wanted to ask you if there's anything else you just wanted to share with us about your work, about yourself, about startups and wellness, before you wrap up.
Well, I could go all night, so that's not a question you should ask me. I can't think of anything without going on another hour tangent. But I would say that I'm really excited to bring in IO psychology, because I think it can have a big impact on the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so I encourage other IO psychologists, if they're listening to this, to start to investigate, the entrepreneurship and startup world, to be a part of that and to contribute to the science.
That is awesome. We love that. And also want to be a part of that. So that's very exciting. And we have one more question for you, which is a fun question, or we think it's fun. We always think our fun questions are fun, whether or not the guests think they're fun. We don't know. But the fun question is, you are an amazing female entrepreneur, but I'm sure you have many, many strengths that you stand out for. But everyone usually has one or two things that are very specific strengths that they stand out for. So what would those who are closest to you say is your superpower?
That's an easy one. They would probably say it's a deadly combination of passion and focus. I have this ability to just sit down and get in the zone. To be in the flow is very easy for me because I'm doing what I love every day. But when I get in that zone, nothing else around me is happening. And it's funny because when I was in grad school, I had a classmate who kind of sat by me when we were doing work, and she would start talking to me, and I would just nod and say yes, and she would think I was responding to her, but my brain was just not there. It wasn't listening to her or anything, but I would just yeah, whatever. And so she finally was like, Nikki, I need your attention, turn and look at me, and now I'm going to answer you a question. Because I can really take anything in the environment, any kind of distraction, and it's just noise, background noise to me. I'm in the task 100%, and being able to focus like that is really awesome to get projects and work done. Not a lot of people can do that. My sister is extremely jealous and tells me that in her head it's very loud and noisy and messy, and she doesn't understand how I can do that. But
that's a good superpower.
Yeah.
I like that one. That's awesome. Well, and also because it stems from the fact that you love what you're doing. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because I actually am similar. And I think my husband wants to smack me half the time. He's just like, look at me, you're not paying attention, smack, like trying to get me to focus, right? Because I'm just sitting there and I'm not and I will do the same thing. I'll just be like, yeah, and he's just like, what did I just say? Repeat what I said. And I just told him, and I say again, and he knows I'm not listening because I'm in the zone for something. So I totally understand.
Mine's always that I say I'll be done soon. Like Brennan will be like, when are you going to be done that? And I'll be like, I'll be done in 10 minutes. And then like 10 minutes go by and 20 minutes. And he's like, are you done yet? And I'm like, I need 10 more minutes. And he's like, oh my God. Like he's just learned, like, if I'm in the middle of doing something, he's like not even going to try to get an estimate of when I'll be done, because I'm like, I have very wishful thinking that I'm going to be done things faster than I am. And so I'll be like, no, like, I want to go to the grocery store too. Like, don't go without me. I'll be 10 minutes, but it's definitely not 10 minutes. So that would be, I think he would probably want to kill me for that, but yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Katina, we always have to answer our own fun questions.
Oh, yeah,
but
I forgot.
Since we have each other on the phone, I kind of feel like you should tell me mine, and I should tell you yours.
Oh, my God.
Ooh, that would be fun.
Oh, my
Yes,
gosh.
let's do that.
Wait, I have to think about this, though.
Okay.
Because you have a lot of things that you're really good at.
I know. You have a million things you're really good at. But I'm going to say the one that stands out as, like, you're very unique about, like, because I think you and I have a lot of overlaps in terms of
I think so
follow
too.
through, things like that. But the one thing that I think that your unique superpower, on top of your many others, is your ability to, like, plan and schedule your day and stick to that plan and schedule. Like, it always amazes me. I know, but it amazes me. I just look at your calendar and I'm like, oh my gosh, she knows exactly what she's doing at every single point of the day, and you actually do it at that point in the day. Like, I cannot do that. That is not me.
I love schedules so much. I am a freak. When I was little, I used to ask my mom to make me a schedule every day. So, and I would follow it. Like, I would really follow it. And then, like, when my brother was born, he didn't want to follow a schedule. My mom thought there was something wrong with him. She brought him to the doctor, and she was like, he won't follow our schedule. And the doctor was like, he's like 2. Like, what are you talking about? And she was like, we follow a schedule every day. We love our schedule, and he won't do it. And the doctor was like, okay, like, this one is the weird one. He is normal. Like, there is something wrong with her. So yeah, I've always loved a schedule. That's a really good one. I do love my schedule. You're correct. So I think you have a very, like, okay, I'll say again, I'm trying to pick something that is not like, you have a million things, and maybe something that's like not overlapping, right? I feel that you have a very good artistic eye for seeing things that, like, look good and look pretty, and you're very good at, like, syncing technology and understanding how to make things look good through the lens and, like, make them look like professional and, like, polished, and, like, you're very good at, like, creating nice, pretty looking things that, like, that are, like, up to date and cool. Like, our whole, like, social media presence would be so ugly if I was in charge of it, and you're very good at that.
Well, thank you. Well, this is like a warm and fuzzy. I love it. Oh my
yeah.
goodness.
So that's
well, now that we've just complimented each other.
Yeah.
Nikki, thank you so much for joining us. It was really fun to have you here. As you can tell, like, we loved everything you were talking about because we immediately related it back to ourselves, which as humans, we are super self-centered all the time, and that's what people do. But we love it, and it was really
didn't
interesting.
know we were going to do that, so by the way.
I do it every day with myself. Like, okay, if I had this problem that this other startup is having, like, how would I do it, and how do we handle
Okay, that makes us feel better.
It's helpful. I mean, you joke about it, but reflection on the way you do things is, I think, one of the most important things you can do to increase self-awareness and improve performance is literally reflect.
You're so nice. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for being here. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And yeah, we will talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you so much to Nikki Blacksmith for joining us today from Blackhawke Behavior Science. It was so much fun talking to her. We hope you enjoyed it as well. You can find more about Blackhawke at Blackhawke, it's BLACKHAWKE.io. We'll have a link, of course, in the show notes, so feel free to go check out their website and their different social media presences. And as always, if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, feedback, please reach out to us. You can find us at contact@workerbeing.com. You can also go on our website, workerbeing.com, go on social at workerbeing, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. The Worker Being podcast is hosted by us, Patricia Grabarek
and Katina Sawyer, and produced by Allie Johnson.